High-quality VR games. A bit of a rarity these days, eh? Well, they are for me at least, and no doubt for many of you too, particularly on PC VR. We all have different standards of what is considered quality or not, and the best I can do is convey mine. So I've put together this list of what I consider to be high-quality VR games as of early 2024. For obvious reasons, I'll be leaving out the titles like Half-Life Alyx and Boneworks because we all know about them already. Though of course they would be on this list otherwise. Boneworks, well, yeah, it would just make it. But what does high quality mean for me? Well, my definition is in this case they are games which successfully meet the following standards throughout their entire presentation. They have visuals which are stable, coherent, and often artistically consistent and strong, with performance levels that make sense and generally run stable. They have audio design that is appropriate and well considered, with all expected ambience, sound effects, foley, and music being present and accounted for, and properly detailed. And they have motion control interaction design that is near free of jank, behaves as intuitively as you'd hope and expect the vast majority of the time, often containing attention to detail in the physics and environmental interactions which elevates the experience into something natural and convincing. These are all elements that when combined together and polished properly, their individual effect is multiplied into something much more, as any good piece of media does. Please note that I only have access to PC VR. I do not own a standalone device or have access to their ecosystems. So if there are any high-quality titles from those places which you think match the standards shown here, let us all know in the comments. So now you know where I'm coming from. Let's get to it. Ancient Dungeon is a 6 or 8-bit style roguelite that transcends its simple appearance with great polish in all aspects of presentation. Further, breaking the mold by also being a VR early access title with a high level of polish. An extremely rare and welcome occurrence. The gameplay is smooth, appropriately responsive, and does everything it aims to do well. That being said, its development is slow going due to the dev deviating from adding more content for over a year now to instead add online co-op, which he has, and it generally works well. So this means that presently the overall amount of content and gameplay variety in Ancient Dungeon is not up to standards for this genre that relies heavily on meaningful modifiers to keep each playthrough engaging. But what content is already there is passable for the asking price, and we can confidently trust more will come. Hopefully. We just need to wait even more for probably a long time. If anything, it's just a treat to play something that is very pleasant on the eyes within the headset, as this kind of art style always tends to be. Seriously, it looks really, really lovely in VR, which based upon what you see in the footage you would never expect, but it really looks great. And because of this, it's easy to run at high frame rates and resolutions, and has that vital sense of care, quality, and detail needed for a VR game to keep you immersed. Compound is another roguelite, 6 or 8-bit or something like that style shooter. It has all the same visual quality advantages as Ancient Dungeon, very pleasing to look at, if not slightly more due to the environment design unique to this one, and also features great attention to detail in all the small things which matter. There's a decent variety of weapons, and with how they're clearly, lovingly designed, the act of just firing them and their accompanying animations and sounds are just excellent and enjoyable to experience in and of itself. The sound design in particular is extremely well done, with everything being punctuated and balanced as you would hope, really emphasizing every action that's happening. There's also an emphasis on physicality in the gunfights. Enemies fire projectiles slow enough to evade in real life. Though it's not mandatory to do this to succeed, you can still just take cover or move away, but it is very gratifying when you physically chain evade a small bullet hell being fired toward you. Its one weakness is the standard enemy AI, whose pathing behavior is easily cheesable, though this is slightly mitigated by their numbers and the ammo considerations you have as a player, and the mini-bosses you find throughout the run do offer up something a little more interesting. It's fully released, no early access here, and it's well worth the asking price. A great example of how a simple shooter concept with a laser focus on what it wants to be, that would probably be overlooked on flat screen, can be significantly elevated and refreshed by a high-quality VR-centric presentation. CubeVR is a creative sandbox voxel game akin to Minecraft, with a particular emphasis on being as visually gorgeous as it possibly can be. The lighting, especially, is quite stunning to behold in a headset. I deliberately said akin to Minecraft because while it sits in the same genre and core concept, CubeVR has its own identity and gameplay loop that's defined by some very impressive, unique, VR-focused motion control interactions, which sets it apart by emphasizing precise physicality, fostering a sense of natural engagement and immersion flat screen simply can't offer. Being the visual spectacle it is, you'll be needing a beefy PC to run it at high settings. Or just get the PlayStation VR 2 version. It's been in early access for a long time and remains so, with a fairly slow development cycle, though the dev is clearly devoted to its continual growth. The gameplay it offers will not be everyone's cup of tea, so ensure you know what you're getting into prior. But when you really get into things with CubeVR, it can foster a zen-like meditative state of focus and peace once you set your mind to doing a creative project. Just like any good hands-on real-life creative project would also do for you, which I think is something worthy of praise. Demeo is the kind of game I'd normally not care for. I've never been a card game nerd, but its high-quality presentation, pleasing cohesive art style, and smooth-feeling interactions combined with a surprisingly deep and challenging battle system really caught me off guard with how much I enjoyed it. This is further elevated with the seamless social aspect of this game, which seeks to emulate the experience of going to a real-life gaming venue, meeting other nerds like yourself, then starting a new campaign together. And whilst you wait, there are little recreational activities within that social space to do together. Having this experience in VR is exponentially more meaningful and intimate than what flat screen could ever offer, but I must emphasize that it works as well as it does because of the high-quality presentation which ties it all together, making everything feel so seamless and comfortable. If it didn't have all this care, heart and detail put into it, and instead had the usual low effort, jank and glitches most VR software is plagued with, it would subconsciously, for us, shatter the experience. Though I doubt most players would be able to verbalize this if they were asked. They would just feel something is off and not want to return as much. Though, for all of my praise, my one critique for Demeo is the asking price of £33.50, which is quite steep. But if you think about it, you can at least rest assured that the quality is there to back up the price, and I would personally rather take one good, successful, cohesive package like this for such a price over buying 3 or 4 disappointing, never-to-be-finished, jank games for roughly £10 each, which end up missing the point of VR and ultimately would demoralize me on the state of software in the industry even more. Half-Life 2 was released 19 years ago, as I write this. A team of modders were given access to the game's source code by Valve and proceeded to make a VR mod, converting the entire experience into what may as well be a native implementation, for the low, low asking price of free. This implementation, lacking some of the finer interaction details you might see from today's better VR games, because, well, it's a mod for a 19-year-old game, has still resulted in one of the most accomplished, fully fledged experiences you can have on PC VR that contains details and polish we still don't get from most dedicated VR dev studios today. Let that sink in for a moment. A near 20-year-old game, converted to VR via a mod, is more convincing, accomplished, and generally does VR shooter gameplay better than most other native VR games do today. Aside from being a testament to the skill and care of the modding team and the source engine's versatility, perhaps, it gives one pause for thought, doesn't it? Pause for thought about today's commercial game engines and what we typically see from them in VR. About the skill of today's VR developers and how they constantly struggle and often downright fail to provide graphical fidelity better than a near 20-year-old game. On top of that, provide less interactivity, less detail, less or no physics, much dumber AI, and yet still manages to make their completely inferior product run several times worse on top of that. It really makes you wonder. If this mod team working on a decades-old game engine can still manage to implement the most natural, accurate, perfect physical grenade throwing I've ever performed in any VR game that always goes where you intend to throw, and yet in practically every other native modern VR game I've tried, throwables are complete jank and near unworkable. If this mod team can have working environment and item collisions which are more accurate and precise to the model you see than most other native VR games can ever manage these days, if this mod team can be asked to keep the little physical interaction flourishes sorely lacking from almost every other VR shooter, even new games being released to this day, if this mod team can accomplish for free what most other full-time paid VR devs have continued to fail at doing properly for years, using Unity and Unreal Engine, it really makes you wonder what the hell is going on. Alongside being celebrated for this mod team's accomplishment, I think the existence of Half-Life 2 VR mod and its success in key areas where so many other titles continue to fail or not even try should be cause for some serious reflection on the state of quality and skill in the industry. Half-Life 2 is a product of its time, and is limited in some ways because of that, which means some physics interactions translated into VR can feel unstable at times, but I can hardly hold that against it, considering the context. Yet, the core game still holds up remarkably well in VR owing to its focus on physics in a fleshed-out, interesting world which can dynamically react to the things you do as a player, providing that vital sense of immersion we need to justify putting on the headset. And as a lovely bonus, it has a compelling, believable cast of characters who are excellently written and voice-acted, even compared to today's standards 2 decades later. A testament to the original dev team. I've never been one to care for, or get attached to, or be compelled by fictional characters, and I've particular disdain for the weirdo simping that goes on for female game characters especially. But I've got to say, Half-Life 2's Alex is best girl, no question. Hubris is a single-player action-adventure that has high production values, as you can probably see in the footage behind me. It wouldn't have made it onto this list had it remained as it was upon first release, but over a year later, with some significant reworks of certain weaknesses, though by no means it's not without a few failings still, I now feel comfortable including the end package on this list. The game's universe seems well realized and interesting, and has some great uses of motion controls. The swimming in particular is some of the best I've experienced, and feels wonderful to gesture. Hubris has narrative ambitions which were clearly not met, and I would say is its biggest weakness still, alongside the game's pacing and short runtime. But for the overall quality, presentation and detail on offer, plus the interesting little VR-centric touches it does try to include here and there for what I consider a reasonable asking price of £25 as of making this video, it's worth it. Iron Wolf VR is a game where you man a classic submarine and use it to take on various missions. It can be considered a simulation of sorts, I think, and has an emphasis on realism and immersion, leveraging VR well for this purpose. To achieve said purpose, the presentation of course needs to be stable and cohesively high quality, to which Iron Wolf delivers. It doesn't go to overwhelming depth with its mechanics, nor are the motion interactions anything unique, they're just basically variations of gripping things, but they work and do as you'd expect, which is still, bewilderingly, something of a rare treat in VR games, even all these years later. You do, as you'd expect, need a brain to play this game, and you are rewarded for being a considerate strategist. It's certainly not suited to a more shallow audience. If you are the kind of player who would drift towards such a gameplay experience though, Iron Wolf allows you to submerge with up to 4 other players mixed between flat screen and VR, and can be played solo if you wish, with the other areas of sub-management being automated at your discretion, or you can handle everything by yourself. It's focused, it does everything it sets out to do, and does them at a level of mostly jank-free quality, and does not let itself sink to the rock-bottom ocean floor of standards like so many others have. Plus, it is still being developed and improved upon. The MOS series is something I avoided until recently, thinking that, for a grown man like me, a third-person camera kiddie platformer game was not something someone of my age and experience would really care for in VR beyond it being a quickly worn, shallow novelty. And boy, was I wrong. My experience playing MOS turned out to be one of the most profound, engaging, and emotionally provocative experiences I've ever had in VR. This is, without question, due to the quality, care, talent, and skill that was given to every little aspect of its design, beautifully merging together into a piece of interactive art that brings a world to life in front of you, in a manner that was so transformative and meaningful for me that MOS, by itself, easily justifies the revolution in gaming that is the VR perspective, as a medium which can evolve how we experience interactive media. And that's not even considering the motion controls on top. I'm just talking about the headset perspective. The ever-frustrating thing about virtual reality is that you can't understand it until you've tried it, though. But not just trying any experience. A janky, low-effort piece of software can greatly damage perceptions of VR as a medium. And if that half-baked jank is the first thing a new user tries, they can easily walk away unconvinced, or at worst, repelled and unwilling to ever try it again. Trying to describe a proper VR experience to someone who has never used it before is like asking you to describe a color they have never seen before. Quite impossible to comprehend until they also see it. And seeing VR gameplay happen on a flat screen can in no way convey the dimensional sensory upgrade it is by comparison. All that being said, I've come to identify that there are VR games which can visually look more interesting on the flat screen mirror than in the headset, due to how the scene is graphically composed and translated, and vice versa, where the flat screen mirror does not convey whatsoever how it looks in the headset. MOS is firmly in the latter category. It looks quite unremarkable and just okay, maybe nice in the flat footage behind my voice, doesn't it? In fact, I would go as far as to say that seeing it as you are now completely and utterly deforms what the developers crafted for us, and is so inaccurate to the experience you see and get within the headset that I consider this background gameplay footage playing behind me now as misinformation, fake news. Yes, flat screen is that bad at conveying virtual reality, and VR really is that profoundly game-changing when the devs don't have skill issues and understand what they're doing with the medium. If you haven't played MOS already, you must. Do it. Don't delay. And hopefully as you do, you will come to understand why such quality levels displayed here matter exponentially more than it does on flat screen, in order to properly realize the legitimacy of the medium. And why every single VR dev, current and aspiring, should both finish the MOS games and then study the GDC talks done by the Polyarc team to get insights on how to do and think about things for VR properly. MOS is a textbook case of an experience coming together to transcend itself, emerging as more than the sum of its parts. Its quality is accomplished enough in every area that it made me feel thankful to VR technology and to the Polyarc team for the opportunity to experience this work of digital, interactive art in my lifetime. And that's coming from someone who is already very acclimated to VR. That's how meaningful it was. Everyone, if you want to see VR gaming dig its way out of the mountain of disappointing, repulsive amateur jank it's currently buried and suffocating under, then it's your and my duties to support the standards here and sing its praises loud for all to hear, so that we can let this kind of talent be rewarded and thrive for all of our benefits. Buying practically anything, supporting low quality, and making out that mediocre, buggy, unfinished jank is the next coming of Christ just because it's in VR, like so many of the terminally online users and other VR content creator PR mouthpieces do, even if it's done with innocent good intentions, is deeply harming the creative industry you want to see succeed. Stop it. You're not doing the right thing. You are instead killing it. Demand better. Jank and mediocrity are okay, so long as there is also a good amount of quality around to counteract it, of which there currently is not enough of in this VR ecosystem. Our collective demands as players dictate the market conditions. Using the kinds of socially malformed weirdos who obsessively attach themselves to commercial products and are the ones who tend to dominate and live in anonymous internet forums because they wouldn't be taken seriously in real life and they know it, using them as a reliable or healthy reference for market demand is clearly not serving us or our quality standards well for the industry, is it? These kinds of people are inordinately louder and ever-present online, but are far and away from the majority market. Quality over quantity could not be more applicable and vitally needed for VR gaming in its current state. And we will not be achieving this by primarily using feedback from online forums and social media platforms. That was my off-script tangent. I hope you liked it. Back to Moss. Buy the game. Play it. Envelop yourself in the gorgeously composed menu music. Sit back and listen to all of it before you start playing. Listen to the sound of the crackling glue playing perfectly and dynamically as you first open the storybook. Listen to the charming narration, the world brought to life so vibrantly through the sights, sounds, and beautifully detailed animations. Drink it all in, then hopefully you'll come to understand how important all of this is for VR. So yeah, I quite liked the game, it was alright. Propagation Paradise Hotel is a short and decent survival horror experience that handles all aspects of presentation well, with a good level of audio-visual fidelity necessary to sell what it's going for. Its main inspiration clearly being taken from the classic Resident Evil games of the PlayStation 1 era. It does nothing particularly exceptional with its mechanics and interactions, and the game clearly has been pared back from larger ambitions, leading to what is an overall short runtime and abrupt ending, which left me feeling wanting. But what is there is decent and does exactly what you'd expect. No more, no less. Really nothing else I can think to say, except that I hope the dev team behind this one get to realize their full ambitions one day, as they clearly are a cut above the average dross we get in VR. Red Matter is an adventure game with a heavy emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving, and a very pretty, well-optimized one to boot. Everything about its presentation is as high quality as you'd hope and expect when the devs involved are talented and don't suffer from skill issues. It features an original setting, though the story itself is somewhat fractured and the total playtime on offer for each game is only a handful of hours each, if you don't get stuck on the puzzles for too long. It does grabbing and small interactions extremely well, still some of the best VR has to offer, particularly in Red Matter 2, where the act of interacting and the physics involved is so well polished and accurate that it is a joy just to pick up and play with mundane objects to see how realistically they behave. The grabbing itself here is an innovation in VR interactivity worthy of huge praise and examination. VR devs pay attention here. They've done a phenomenal job. The overall gameplay isn't especially deep or innovative, but in terms of visual polish and final quality, the Red Matter series easily sits alongside the likes of Half-Life Alyx and Moss. UNDERDOGS is yet another roguelite, as if VR isn't already drowning in that genre, but this one sets itself apart in my eyes for all the right reasons. The premise is simple. You're in a mech which mimics your hand movements. You can only move by grabbing the floor and dragging yourself along, and you utilize this basic physical movement in varying arena battles to melee your way through them with an assortment of upgrades and modifiers you get along the way as expected from this genre. I want to make clear that this isn't a mech game, as traditional expectations might have you assume. It's a melee brawler that uses your being in a mech as a context. That's it. You can swap out the mech for anything else that mimics your hand movements, and the resulting core gameplay will still be the same. So, set those expectations accordingly. What is really outstanding about UNDERDOGS is the execution of its physical input system. It translates your physical intentions pretty much perfectly. There is no jank to be found here. Once it clicks with you that you can treat and trust your virtual arms as if they were your own, and just use them intuitively and successfully without thought as you would in real life, it provides a level of psychological ease and immersion that is quite profound and rare to find in VR, knowing that you can trust this implementation not to fail you. You can fully focus on the gameplay. This is so precious to have in VR, and the devs have done a remarkable job here. On top of this, the game also oozes with style and polish, and utilizes its lower poly aesthetic for great performance with a strong, high-quality art style to complement it. You can tell the devs had a very focused vision, which understands VR's more physical nature, and have crafted an experience which plays to that strength in a contextually simple, yet greatly satisfying way. I was caught off guard by the quality of everything presented here, and the subsequent enjoyment I had from it all coming together. Do not overlook UNDERDOGS. While VR may be very worn on the roguelite genre at the moment, at least it is for me, UNDERDOGS is proof that it can still be great and worthwhile if it properly leans on the medium with quality, execution, and presentation in all regards. Until You Fall is already quite well known, so I won't linger on this one for long. It is another roguelite, though it came out back when the fatigue for that genre had yet to set in. It doesn't use VR or physics in any unique way, preferring instead to have the melee combat be abstracted, which put me off initially, but it actually is really well done and quite engaging. The presentation here is all good stuff. It looks good, sounds good, responds well to you, and has nice little stylish touches throughout, doing everything right so your actions are responded to with wonderful exaggerated impact and graceful polish. I avoided this one for a long while, thinking the package as a whole would be too shallow, especially being roguelite, but I was mostly wrong, reminding me yet again of how much a high-quality, jank-free presentation and interaction and all the pleasing subtleties that occur as a result, simple or abstracted as they may be, can still be joyful to engage with and notably elevated in VR. Vertigo 2 is one of the most original, higher-quality adventure shooter games, if not the most original I've played in VR. Its production values are not quite as high as the likes of the big hitters such as Moss or Red Matter, but it makes up for this in spades by offering an extensive, lengthy, wondrous, and challenging single-player adventure to make your way through, alongside a nice amount of extras for replayability. For veteran nerds like myself who have experienced pretty much every genre and setting gaming has offered, and can, for better or worse, accurately predict almost exactly how a game will play out from a brief glance at its trailer, because of how predictable the industry is now, Vertigo 2 was a treasured experience for me, because throughout the total roughly 18 hours of my first playthrough, I had absolutely no idea what the game was going to throw at me from moment to moment, mechanically or narratively. And I loved having that sense of unknown wonder once again, even more so to experience that in VR. But I want to stress again, as I have a few times already, this could only all come together to be such a lovely, memorable experience because the presentation quality is high and the jank is minimal. The world, despite its absurdity, feels convincing and responds to your actions, which all generally work as you'd hope. The journey pulls off a balance of self-aware humor while still retaining an immersive gravitas and sense of scale which successfully keeps you suspending your disbelief all the way through. Presentation-wise, it doesn't quite sit alongside the heavy hitters featured in this list, only missing that standard by a small amount, but Vertigo 2 is still a must-have VR game, and is the best overall adventure experience I have ever had in VR to date. And you know that's saying a lot coming from me. Vox Machinae is, bizarrely, one of a tiny few of somewhat simulator mech games left standing in VR, despite that medium being so perfectly suited to this perspective and input method. You pilot enormous mechs in a well-realized universe, with physics being the primary driver in how you consider your actions like weapon fire and movement, alongside a cockpit with some basic interactions. It's also beautifully optimized and runs like a dream. The game features a single-player campaign and multiplayer, though was originally envisioned as a multiplayer-only title, and the latter is where you'll find the bulk of the gameplay content. I admittedly have a lot of preference issues with the choices Vox has made with its gameplay, in what I feel is a lacking experience in too many key ways that ultimately lets the whole thing down, but I still have great respect for what it chooses to do and the presentation it does it with. The devs here are talented, and I feel they understand the strengths of VR. This is obvious in the execution on offer here. But for me, Vox feels deliberately hamstrung in a very awkward place of gameplay compromise and lacking focus, which ends up satisfying no particular way as a result. Its higher quality presentation not being enough to make up for that. But again, I must stress, this is very much a lack of resonation with my own personal preferences. You might feel very differently. The quality and care here are undeniable though, regardless of my liking it or not. Definitely a good show-off title as a VR cockpit mech game, and my feelings on the gameplay, as I said, may be very different from yours, so I'd happily say it's still well worth experiencing if you feel any kind of interest from what I've said and from the footage. The talent of these devs are worth supporting. Wanderer is an ambitious, time-traveling puzzle adventure game. It doesn't leverage VR interactivity to any special degree, but it is well enough put together and original enough of an experience, with a decent runtime, interesting ideas, high production values, and a level of polish which comfortably earns it a place on this list. It features many set pieces throughout different time periods, and the emphasis is always primarily on puzzle solving, some of which I found to be a bit obscure and quite difficult during my playthrough, definitely causing things to become a touch tedious at times, though I'm happy to concede to those things being just a skill issue on my part. For whatever reason, the devs have decided to remake the game with what looks to be much more player freedom and interactivity, and are planning to release that remake in later 2024. So, probably best you hang on for that, assuming it comes out as a complete experience and isn't early access. That's the end of the main list. Now on to a handful of honourable mentions of games that I feel couldn't quite make the main list because of some issues they have, but are still just on the cusp of getting there if they are given the updates and polish needed. After the Fall is often referred to as VR's Left 4 Dead, which I think is recklessly stated by players and is misleading. It only justifies that comparison in the most shallow and obvious of ways by sharing the same general game concept. While it clearly has good quality and creative presentation in many aspects, the core gameplay of shooting the zombie hordes falls flat in a way which is jarring and detracting for it to succeed in a VR context especially, let alone have it be thoughtlessly compared with the nuanced and well-considered design of Left 4 Dead, which makes that game what it is. In spite of After the Fall's visual polish and spectacle, the shooting interactions feel hollow, exacerbated by how the zombies also don't feel a convincing part of the world. I think this is due to their stiff, unreactive animations that respond poorly to your gunfire, and they also have a weird floatiness to them when they are moving and attacking, which further contributes to that uncanny sense of disconnect, leading to a very limp, unconvincing, and unsatisfying shooting experience moment to moment that the rest of the presentation quality cannot salvage. That's why I only give it an honourable mention. Looks high quality overall and can definitely be enjoyable with lowered expectations, but still too lacking in execution in its most important area of the gameplay loop. Vertigo Games as a company, I think, need to evolve their approach to how they make VR titles, as what they're producing mechanically now often feels out of date compared with modern-day competition. The disconnect between the good visual detail they're capable of, which sets expectations in the user's mind, but then has disappointing, shallow-feeling, half-baked VR interactions, is a trend they seem to be stuck in, and is quite disappointing when they clearly have the resources and talent to reach a much higher bar. Or maybe they don't have that talent and that's why their games are the way they are. Arizona Sunshine 2, their latest release, which was very disappointing for me, is a prime example of their regressive mechanical trends in action. Bootstrap Island is a recently released title which I would have liked to include on the main list if not for issues which may very well be exclusive to only me and my computer. But as I am only me, and I'm making this list, I can just give it an honourable mention. It's a roguelite, but this one also sets itself apart with a unique enough premise that has an overall high quality and focus on very nice motion interactions which come with the kind of detail we love to see in VR. It's not a traditional survival game in its current form, even though it may look like one. It's actually intended to be played in short, intense sessions of exploring and scavenging during the day and surviving through the night against hostile creatures for as long as you can, all the while trying to uncover the island's secrets. It's good stuff. It's early access, and as such is certainly lacking plenty of polish in both interactions and visuals, but is still far more complete and high quality of an experience than your typical early access VR offering, or even many fully released games. When talking about Moss, I mentioned how different VR games look better or worse on the flat-screen mirror, and Bootstrap Island is the opposite of Moss, looking far better on the mirror than it does in the headset, due to, in my technically ignorant opinion, using too many traditional flat-screen rendering techniques and effects, which look quite unpleasant or wrong in VR when smashed together as they are here. How NVIDIA's upscaling DLSS is handled here in particular looks pretty awful in the headset, but fine on the mirror footage you're seeing behind me. Yet, having DLSS is quite a vital setting for performance reasons. Bootstrap Island, much like cyubeVR, is a demanding game to run. It doesn't try to hide that, and despite my PC specs being comfortably above what's recommended, I cannot run this game without constant, severe, immersion-shattering frame stutter no matter how I try and configure the game or the settings on my PC, to the point that it kills my motivation to play it further. From my experience with VR games made using Unreal Engine, a larger percentage of them don't seem to play nice with my Ryzen 9 CPU model from AMD, and Bootstrap Island is by far the worst. Most others haven't reported suffering from this stuttering issue though, so you likely, probably, hopefully won't either. If you can run it, give it a try if what you've seen and heard sounds good. In spite of my personal performance issues killing the game for me, it's still an interesting, high-quality offering all in all. I just wish I could play and tell you more about it. The Light Brigade is a roguelite VR shooter with procedurally generated levels. It has an original setting, a simple yet decent visual presentation with a strong enough cohesive art style to carry it all, and can offer smooth, engaging gameplay when everything comes together. It gets an honourable mention only due to key areas which continue to hold it back, in my opinion. Those things being low-quality, dumb AI that offers difficulty only in the laziest of ways by having them permanently wall-hack and track you after you've been spotted, and just endlessly shoot at your position with a few rare attempts at rushing you. The AI also have poor animations, then there is occasionally glitchy sound and overlapping music tracks, lackluster boss fights that suffer from all the issue I just mentioned, and semi-regular visual glitches in the environments, really letting the whole thing down. Underneath all of this, though, is a very slick-feeling VR shooter which has a good foundation, decent potential, and reliable, weighty, yet snappy interactions that are satisfying to perform. Except for the very boring, dull, low-quality AI, the Light Brigade is good or okay quality in most areas, but not high quality. It needs a sizable polish pass to ascend it to that level. A polish pass which I think wouldn't be unrealistic to achieve if the devs really wanted and if their playtesters had higher standards. It could happen, I hope it does, but I'm not holding my breath. Worth an honourable mention regardless. Z.O.N.A Project X is a stalker-like that has a great atmosphere, passable sound detail, and a survival gameplay loop that can be quite engaging when getting into it. There's a lot of potential here, and the dev making it is one of the few shining examples of early access done right, with his frequency of meaningful updates and humble communication with reasonable users. As much as I'd love to feature it on the main list, I can only give it an honourable mention here, because the current flaws it has are too compromising on the overall experience goals. Once again, the AI is the biggest issue by far. The artificial intelligence in its present state is a joke, brain-dead, and a complete non-threat unless you sleepwalk into them by accident. Their lack of threat and believability as an actual living entity in any way terminally harms Z.O.N.A's intended immersion. The dev is well aware of this, and apparently an AI overhaul is planned, but whether that AI overhaul will still live up to the standards set by the world it's placed in remains to be seen. There are other little nitpicks and oddities relating to the interaction polish, and there are some performance issues, janky enemy animations, and sound effect quality which can also detract, and so on. But the AI really is the biggest thing which breaks it all. It needs to be properly threatening to justify the tension and oppression the game world is obviously trying to create. Definitely keep an eye on this one. Ignoring the AI issues, it's already decent, but could be great given the right focus, patches, and polish. And this dev has proven he's up to the task so far, so I definitely believe it could happen. And that's the end of my list. VR gaming is trapped in a bit of a vicious cycle at the moment, and it has been for a while. As I've hopefully illustrated from this list, VR games need a much higher base quality in all aspects to justify itself, alongside a deeper understanding of the medium's strengths from its developers. Sadly, those who might be capable of such quality will not make games for VR because the market remains too small to justify that effort in their eyes. Which in turn keeps the market smaller and declining because there are nowhere near enough quality games to attract more players to justify the effort of making a quality game. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Without going into laborious detail of the elements that make an appropriately good and compelling VR game, at least in my opinion, the solution to this, I believe, as it always has been for the industry, is really quite simple. Make a good game that people want to play. Let people know about that game, and more players will come. Then they'll quickly share how good it is, word of mouth spreads, and then more players will come. Players want to play good games. They will find a way, no matter the obstacle, if that game is good enough. The good quality games that genuinely capture and compel find their way into the spotlight by the virtue of them being good. They sell. They are praised highly. This clearly observable and obvious behavior does not need genius-grade analysis and foresight to work out. Console manufacturers have been leveraging this behavior for decades with games designated as system sellers. You're all familiar with this. In the case of VR gaming, what's considered good is a different beast compared to flat screen. Subconscious expectations for a user are very different when they put on a headset and have motion controls, compared to sitting back and looking at a TV. Using VR, we now find ourselves physically embodied within the world, and we realize our movements can now participate and interact with that world in a way akin to real life. The implications of this realization are massive, and it is the developer's job to be aware of this and design to these strengths. I think the average user isn't consciously aware of these things though, or would know how to verbalize them well even if they were. They just feel a strong emotional impression as a sum total. Many tricks we can get away with in flat-screen design do not work in VR, and vice versa, because of the ginormous input and perspective change. It really is quite simple, guys. Supporting mediocre jank is not helping the medium. It's not growing it, it's stagnating it. This is obvious. We think we're keeping the medium alive, we're really not. What needs to be done is that we understand the strengths of VR, build a good, high-quality game, and people will come. Your game will sell and succeed, and the player base grows. That's the way it always has been. There is nothing to overthink here. Thanks for watching. Dear viewer, if you think my presence as a VR content creator has value and you feel it is important I continue to stick around, then I humbly ask that you consider supporting me via a Patreon donation. I only ever ask for £1 per produced content. The idea of this being that by itself £1 is entirely negligible, almost nothing. But if combined together with many others, then suddenly that negligible contribution amounts to something that is more than the sum of its parts. Much like I feel we need to do with VR development. Less solo work, more coming together and collaborating, because in the big picture of life, we are quite useless and ineffective as individuals. But when coming together, mountains can be moved. If I could get only 100 of the thousands of people who watch my content to donate just £1 per creation, then that would be quite literally life-changing for me and family, and further bolster what I can do as a content creator without being beholden or tempted by corporate agendas just to get by. So if you do have such small amounts to spare per month and believe it worthwhile, I would be extremely grateful. Thank you for watching, and see you again soon.